The morning sun cast long shadows across Redstone Army Base as Jessica Reynolds stepped through the main gate. Her worn brown leather jacket zipped halfway up despite the Alabama heat. At 36, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove to anyone. Her short, sandy brown hair was practical rather than fashionable, and her sun-weathered skin told stories she'd never share willingly. The security guard barely glanced at her civilian contractor badge as she passed through. Just another tech worker, another face in the crowd of people who kept the base running behind the scenes. That's exactly how Jessica preferred it. She'd been hired as a weapons technician, a job that required precision and patience, two qualities she possessed in abundance. What her employment file didn't mention was that she'd learned those skills in places most people couldn't pronounce, under conditions that would break most soldiers before they even understood what was happening. The firing range was her first assignment, a sprawling facility where young soldiers learned to shoot straight and follow orders. As she walked toward the equipment shed, rolling up her sleeves in the morning heat, she exposed the tattoo on her left forearm, a detailed hawk with spread wings rendered in gray and black ink. Beneath it, in precise military font, were the numbers 032K. "Check out the new girl," Private Danny Foster whispered to his buddy, Marcus Webb, as they watched Jessica unlock the equipment shed. "Looks like she's trying way too hard to fit in." Marcus squinted at the tattoo from across the range. "Is that supposed to be some kind of military thing? Probably got it done at a strip mall parlor, thinking it would make her look tough." There. Laughter attracted a small crowd of soldiers, all fresh-faced recruits who'd been at the base for less than 6 months. To them, Jessica was just another civilian contractor trying to play soldier, complete with what they assumed was a fake military tattoo. "My girlfriend could probably do better work than that," Danny continued, pulling out his phone to snap a picture. This is going straight to the group chat. Within minutes, the photo had spread through their unit with the caption, "Phoenix wannabe just landed at base," followed by several laughing emojis. The mockery was swift and merciless, the way it always was among young soldiers trying to prove their own legitimacy. Jessica heard every word. Her hands never paused as she began organizing the rifle scopes that needed calibration, but those who looked closely might have noticed the slight tightening of her jaw, the only sign that their words had any effect at all. She'd been through this before, though not quite like this. For 8 years, she'd lived in anonymity, working odd jobs across the country, never staying in one place too long. The decision to return to military life, even as a civilian, hadn't been easy. But she'd heard about the training accidents, the equipment failures, the young soldiers dying because of mistakes that could have been prevented. That's why she was here. Not for recognition, not for glory, but because she couldn't sleep at night, knowing that kids were getting killed by the same kinds of errors that had destroyed her own team. As she worked, adjusting rifle scopes with the practiced precision of someone who'd done it countless times under pressure, more soldiers gathered to watch. Their comments grew bolder, their laughter louder. They saw her steady hands and assumed she was showing off. They saw her focused concentration and assumed she was trying too hard. What they didn't see was the ghost she'd become, the woman who'd been officially dead for 8 years, but had never stopped living. They didn't see the teammate who'd carried her wounded squad leader for 3 miles through enemy territory, or the sniper who'd held her position for 48 hours straight, without resupply while calling in coordinates that saved an entire convoy. They saw a tattoo and assumed it was fake. They saw a quiet woman and assumed she was weak. They saw a civilian contractor and assumed she was nobody important. By lunchtime, the whispers followed her everywhere. "Did you see that wannabe military tattoo? She's trying so hard to look tough. Bet she's got a whole collection of fake medals at home." Jessica ate her sandwich in silence, her eyes focused on her plate, letting the mockery wash over her. Like rain, she'd learned long ago that the people who talked the most usually had the least to say. The people who'd earned the right to mock her were all dead, buried in a classified cemetery under names that would never appear on any monument. But as she sat there, listening to children play soldier while she tried to forget what being a real soldier had cost her, something shifted in her expression. It wasn't anger. She'd left anger behind in the desert 8 years ago. It wasn't hurt. She'd been hurt by people who actually mattered. It was something else entirely. Something that would have made those laughing soldiers very uncomfortable, if they'd been smart enough to recognize it. It was the look of someone who'd been underestimated before, and remembered exactly how that had turned out for the people doing the underestimating. The afternoon heat shimmered off the concrete as Jessica made her way to the automated targeting system that had been malfunctioning for weeks. The range's computerized equipment was supposed to make training more efficient, but like most technology, it only worked when someone who understood was operating it properly. She'd been studying the technical manuals for the past hour, not because she needed to learn how the system worked, but because she needed to understand how it had been modified since she'd last used one. The basic principles were the same. The same targeting algorithms, the same calibration protocols she'd used in places where a miscalculation meant death rather than just a failed training exercise. A group of soldiers had gathered to watch her work, their skepticism evident in their crossed arms and smirking expressions. Among them was Sergeant Kyle Morrison, a 24-year-old infantry leader who'd been trying to fix the targeting system for the better part of a month. "This should be good," Morrison muttered to his squad. "Watch her pretend she knows what she's doing." Jessica ignored the commentary as she opened the system's control panel. The circuit boards and wiring were more advanced than what she'd worked with before, but the underlying logic was identical. Her fingers moved with practiced efficiency, making micro-adjustments that most technicians would need hours to figure out. "She's acting like some kind of professional sniper," Private Foster laughed, the same soldier who'd photographed her tattoo that morning. "What's next? Is she going to tell us she's been to Afghanistan?" The targeting system's display screen flickered as Jessica continued her work. She'd identified the problem within the first 30 seconds, a calibration error that had been throwing off the entire system. The fix was simple if you knew what to look for, but complex enough that it had stumped the base's regular technicians. "There," she said quietly, stepping back as the display stabilized. The range calibration was off by 0.03 degrees. Should work fine now. Morrison stepped forward, his expression skeptical. 0.03 degrees? That's barely measurable. How could you possibly test it?" Jessica interrupted, her voice calm but firm. Morrison activated the system, and for the first time in weeks, it ran perfectly. The targeting display showed precise coordinates. The automated functions responded smoothly, and the diagnostic readouts all came back green. The soldiers watching exchanged glances, their mockery replaced by grudging surprise. "Where did you learn to do that?" Morrison asked, his tone less condescending than before. "I didn't learn it," Jessica replied, wiping sweat from her forehead with her sleeve. "I used it in 20-knot sandstorms where if you got it wrong, people died." The casual mention of combat conditions sent a ripple of uncertainty through the group. That wasn't the kind of thing someone learned from YouTube tutorials or technical manuals. That was the voice of experience, hard-earned and paid for in ways most people couldn't imagine. But before anyone could process what she'd said, another group of soldiers approached, drawn by the commotion. Among them was Private First Class Jake Williams, whose older brother had served in special operations before being killed in action 3 years earlier. Williams caught sight of Jessica's tattoo as she rolled her sleeve back down, and something about it made him pause. The hawk design was intricate, professionally done, but it was the numbers beneath it that caught his attention. 032K. The format was familiar, though he couldn't quite place it. "Hey," he said, approaching Jessica with a mixture of curiosity and respect. "That tattoo, is that a unit designation?" Jessica's expression didn't change, but she held his gaze for a long moment before answering. "It was. My brother had something similar. He was in special ops before he—" Williams trailed off then. Tried again. He said the really dangerous units, the ones that did classified work, they had their own ways of marking themselves, in case something happened and regular dog tags weren't enough. The other soldiers had gone quiet, sensing that. The conversation had shifted into territory they didn't understand. Jessica studied William's face, seeing something in his eyes that the others lacked, the kind of respect that came from personal loss, from understanding that war was more than just uniforms and training exercises. "Your brother was right," she said finally. "Some units, the ones that worked alone, far from support, they marked themselves differently. Not for glory, but for identification. So, if something went wrong, there would be proof they'd been there." "Jesus," Morrison whispered, his earlier skepticism evaporating. "You're talking about Black Ops stuff. Deep cover reconnaissance." Jessica didn't confirm or deny anything. She simply closed the targeting system's control panel and began gathering her tools. But as she worked, Williams noticed something else. The way she moved, the way she held herself, the way she constantly scanned her surroundings even in the safety of the base. Those weren't the habits of a civilian contractor. Those were the ingrained reflexes of someone who'd survived situations where a moment's inattention could be fatal. "Ma'am," Williams said quietly, "if you don't mind me asking, what happened?" "To your unit?" Jessica paused in her work, her hands stilling for just a moment. When she looked up, her expression was distant, as if she were seeing something far beyond the Alabama firing range. "They're all dead," she said simply. "Have been for 8 years. Sometimes I forget I'm not supposed to be here either." The weight of her words settled over the group like a shroud. This wasn't someone playing soldier or trying to impress anyone. This was someone who'd been through hell and somehow walked out the other side, carrying the ghosts of her fallen teammates in a tattoo that nobody else understood. As Jessica finished packing her equipment, she noticed a convoy of vehicles approaching the range. Military police escorts, staff cars, the kind of official motorcade that meant someone important was visiting. She watched with mild interest as the convoy slowed, then stopped completely when the lead vehicle's occupant caught sight of her. Colonel James Ross, former commander of the Phoenix Reconnaissance Unit, stepped out of his staff car with the deliberate movements of someone who'd just seen a ghost. His face had gone pale, and his hand trembled slightly as he reached for his radio. "All units, stand down," he said, his voice carrying the authority of 30 years in uniform. "That's her." The soldiers around Jessica turned to look at the colonel, confusion written across their faces. But Jessica simply shouldered her equipment bag and waited, her expression unreadable. After 8 years of being dead, she was about to become very much alive. Colonel Ross approached Jessica with the careful steps of a man walking through a minefield. His eyes never left her face, as if he were afraid she might disappear if he looked away for even a second. The soldiers who'd been mocking her tattoo just hours earlier now stood frozen, sensing that something monumental was happening, but not understanding what. "Sergeant Reynolds," Ross said, his voice thick with emotion. "I never thought I'd see you again." Jessica looked up from the rifle case she'd been securing, her expression neutral, but her eyes holding depths that spoke of years of pain carefully contained. "Colonel," she replied simply. "It's just Jessica now." "The hell it is," Ross said, then caught himself. "Ma'am, the records, they said you were killed in action. How are you here?" "Records are wrong sometimes," Jessica said, her tone matter of fact. People make mistakes. Coordinates get mixed up. Teams get abandoned. Things happen. The words hit Ross like physical blows. He'd been the one to authorize the mission that had supposedly killed her entire team. He'd been the one to sign off on the intelligence that had marked their position as enemy territory. He'd been the one to order the airstrike that had allegedly eliminated hostile forces, not realizing he was targeting his own people. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, then louder. "Jesus Christ, what have we done?" Private Williams, who'd been listening intently, stepped forward. "Sir, what's going on? Who is she?" Ross turned to address the gathered soldiers, his face showing every one of his 53 years. This woman, Sergeant Jessica Reynolds, call sign Falcon Zero, was the reconnaissance sniper for Operation Kilo Dust. She was part of a 3-person team that was supposed to provide intelligence for a major operation. 8 years ago, he paused, struggling with words that had haunted him for nearly a decade. Due to a coordinate error, her team was marked as enemy combatants. They were listed as missing in action after an airstrike on their position. We assumed they were all dead. The silence that followed was deafening. The soldiers who'd been laughing about her fake tattoo now realized they'd been mocking a memorial. The hawk with spread wings wasn't decoration. It was a grave marker for her teammates, and for the woman who'd officially died 8 years ago, but had somehow kept living. "You let us think you were dead," Ross continued, his voice breaking. "For 8 years, I've been living with the guilt of losing your team. Why didn't you contact us? Why didn't you come home?" Jessica's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes, a flash of the pain she'd been carrying for 8 years. Because coming home would have meant investigations, court-martials, careers destroyed, good people paying for one mistake that wasn't theirs to make. She touched the tattoo on her arm, the number 032K that had identified her team. Besides, the people who needed to know who I was already knew. The people who mattered didn't need an investigation to tell them what happened. Sergeant Morrison, who'd been listening with growing horror, stepped forward. "Ma'am, your team, what happened to them?" Jessica was quiet for a long moment, her eyes distant. "Corporal Jenkins took shrapnel from the first airstrike. Died in my arms about 6 hours later. Staff Sergeant Martinez lasted 2 days before infection from his wounds killed him. I buried them both in the desert with my own hands." She looked around at the faces surrounding her, seeing the shock and shame beginning to register. "I spent 3 days walking back to friendly territory, living off cactus water and whatever I could find. By the time I made it to an extraction point, the operation was over and everyone had moved on. Officially, we'd all been killed in action. Unofficially, nobody wanted to deal with the paperwork of bringing a ghost back to life." "My God," Ross breathed. "Why didn't you fight it? Why didn't you demand recognition?" "Because I'd seen what happened to the families of the soldiers who died in that operation," Jessica replied. "They got their benefits, their honors, their closure. If I'd come forward, all of that would have been thrown into question. Congressional hearings, media investigations. Those families would have lost everything they'd been given to help them heal." She stood up, shouldering her equipment bag. "I chose to stay dead rather than destroy the peace that other people had found. It seemed like the right thing to do at the time." The soldiers who'd been gathered around her stood in stunned silence, processing the magnitude of what they'd just learned. This quiet woman who'd endured their mockery all day wasn't just a veteran, she was a ghost. Someone who'd sacrificed her own identity to protect others. Private Foster, who'd taken the photo of her tattoo that morning, stepped forward with tears in his eyes. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology. We all do. We had no idea. You had no reason to know," Jessica interrupted. "And you don't owe me anything. I came back because I heard about the training accidents, The equipment failures, the kids dying because of mistakes that could be prevented. I came back to make sure you don't repeat the errors that got my team killed." She looked around at the faces surrounding her, seeing shame and respect and something else understanding. "The tattoo isn't about me. It's about the people who didn't come home. When you see someone carrying that kind of weight, you don't laugh. You say thank you." Colonel Ross stepped forward, his hand extended. "Sergeant Reynolds, I'm sorry. The Army is sorry. If there's anything we can do, there is something," Jessica said, shaking his hand. "Stop losing people to preventable mistakes. Train these soldiers properly. Make sure they understand that the equipment they're using was paid for with blood, and that every time they treat it carelessly, they're disrespecting the people who died to give them the freedom to make mistakes." She turned to leave, then paused. "And Colonel? I'm not a sergeant anymore. I'm just Jessica. I gave up my rank the same day I gave up my life. I don't need it back." As she walked away, the soldiers who'd been mocking her just hours earlier stood at attention, watching her leave with the respect they should have shown from the beginning. They'd learned something that day that no training manual could teach, that real warriors don't need to prove they're warriors. They just show up and do the work, quietly and competently, without fanfare or recognition. And sometimes when the truth finally comes out, the people who laughed learn that respect isn't about what you can see on the surface. It's about what someone has endured beneath it. Word spread through Redstone Army Base like wildfire. Within hours, every soldier, officer, and civilian contractor knew the story of Jessica Reynolds, the ghost who'd returned to life, the woman who'd been officially dead for 8 years, but had never stopped serving. The base commander, General Patricia Hayes, called an emergency meeting in her office that evening. Colonel Ross sat across from her desk, his face haggard with the weight of 8 years of guilt finally acknowledged. "Explain to me how we lost track of a decorated soldier for 8 years, Hayes said, her voice cold with controlled anger. "Explain to me how Sergeant Reynolds has been living as a civilian while we've been telling her family she was dead." "She doesn't have family, ma'am," Ross replied quietly. "Parents died when she was 17. No siblings. No next of kin listed in her file. When the team went missing, there was nobody to notify except the Army." "That's not the point, Colonel. The point is that we failed her. We failed her so completely that she chose to stay dead rather than trust us to do the right thing." Hayes pulled out a thick file of Jessica's service record, which had been sealed since Operation Kilo Dust. 17 citations for valor, 3 Bronze Stars, 2 Silver Stars, a Distinguished Service Cross, and we lost her because of a coordinate error that should never have happened. She slammed the file down on her desk. "Do you know what she's been doing for the past 8 years? Working as a mechanic in small towns across the country. Living in cheap apartments, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. Never using her real name, never claiming any benefits, never seeking any recognition for what she sacrificed." Ross winced. "Ma'am, I take full responsibility. You should. But responsibility doesn't bring back 8 years of her life. It doesn't give her back the career she earned or the peace she deserved." Hayes stood up, pacing to the window that overlooked the base. "She's been living like a ghost because we made her into one." The next morning, Hayes called a full base assembly. Every soldier, every officer, every civilian contractor was required to attend. They gathered in the main auditorium, confused and curious about the unusual summons. Jessica sat in the back row, having been personally requested by the general. She changed into a simple black dress, the only formal clothing she owned, and her tattoo was visible on her exposed forearm. Some of the soldiers who'd mocked her the day before couldn't meet her eyes. General Hayes took the stage, her expression grave. "Yesterday, many of you met a woman named Jessica Reynolds. Some of you may have formed opinions about her based on her appearance, her civilian clothes, or her tattoo. Today, you're going to learn who she really is. She gestured to the large screen behind her, where Jessica's service record appeared in stark black and white. Sergeant Jessica Reynolds, call sign Falcon 0, served with distinction in 3 combat deployments. She was a reconnaissance sniper with the Phoenix Unit, specializing in deep cover intelligence gathering in hostile territory. The auditorium was dead silent as Hayes continued. 8 years ago, due to a coordinate error during Operation Kilo Dust, her 3-person team was marked as enemy combatants. They were listed as missing in action after an airstrike on their position. For 8 years, this woman has been officially dead. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. Yesterday, she fixed a targeting system that our best technicians couldn't repair. She did it in 2 minutes, using skills she learned in combat zones where mistakes meant death. When asked where she'd learned those skills, she said she'd used them in 20-knot sandstorms. A murmur ran through the audience as soldiers began to understand the magnitude of what they'd witnessed. This wasn't just technical expertise. This was combat experience at the highest level. The reason she could fix that system so quickly, Hayes continued, is because she'd used identical equipment to call in coordinates that saved an entire convoy of soldiers. She'd used it while under enemy fire with wounded teammates in conditions that would break most people before they even understood what was happening. She turned to look directly at Jessica, who sat motionless in the back row. She chose to remain dead rather than expose the mistakes that led to her team's loss. She chose to protect the families of other fallen soldiers rather than fight for her own recognition. She chose to live in anonymity rather than seek the justice she deserved. The auditorium was completely silent now, every person present understanding that they were in the presence of someone extraordinary, someone who'd made sacrifices they couldn't even comprehend. She returned to us not for recognition, not for benefits, not for apologies, Hayes said. She returned because she heard about training accidents, equipment failures, young soldiers dying because of preventable mistakes. She came back to make sure you don't repeat the errors that killed her. Teammates. Hayes stepped down from the podium and walked to where Jessica sat. Sergeant Reynolds, would you please stand? Jessica stood reluctantly, uncomfortable with the attention, but respecting the general's request. Every person in the auditorium rose to their feet, applauding with the kind of respect reserved for true heroes. The Army owes you more than we can ever repay, Hayes said, her voice carrying across the silent auditorium. We owe you 8 years of your life, 8 years of recognition, 8 years of the peace you should have had. Jessica shook her head slightly. I don't need repayment, ma'am. I just need to know these kids won't make the same mistakes that got good people killed. Then, that's what we'll do, Hayes replied. Starting today, every soldier on this base will learn proper equipment maintenance from you. Every targeting system will be calibrated to your standards. Every training exercise will be conducted with the understanding that carelessness costs lives. She turned to address the assembled soldiers. And every person here will remember that when you see someone carrying invisible weight, you don't laugh. You say thank you. You show respect. You remember that some battles are fought, so you can sleep safely at night. As the assembly dispersed, soldiers approached Jessica one by one. Not to apologize, she'd made it clear she didn't need apologies, but to shake her hand, to thank her, to acknowledge what she'd sacrificed for people she'd never met. Private Foster, who'd photographed her tattoo in Mockery just 24 hours earlier, was among the last to approach. Ma'am, he said, his voice thick with emotion, I want you to know that I deleted that photo. And I'm going to make sure everyone knows what that tattoo really means. Jessica nodded, then surprised him by placing a hand on his shoulder. "The tattoo isn't about me, son. It's about the people who didn't come home. Remember that, and you'll never dishonor it again." As she walked away, Jessica felt something she hadn't experienced in 8 years, the weight of recognition, not for herself, but for the teammates who died beside her. Their sacrifice had finally been acknowledged, their memory honored, their names spoken with the respect they'd earned. She was still a ghost, still someone who'd officially died 8 years ago. But now, she was a ghost with a purpose, a mission that would ensure their deaths hadn't been meaningless. The real work was just beginning. 3 weeks after the base assembly, Jessica had transformed from ghost to guardian. She declined every offer to return to active duty, every attempt to restore her rank, every suggestion that she deserved official recognition. Instead, she'd accepted a permanent position as senior weapons instructor, a role that gave her the authority to implement the changes she'd died to make. The firing range had become her domain, and under her guidance, it had been transformed. From a place where soldiers learned to shoot to a place where they learned to survive. Every piece of equipment was calibrated to military precision. Every training exercise conducted with the understanding that the smallest mistake could cost lives. Weapons maintenance isn't about following a checklist, she told a group of new recruits as they stripped down their rifles for the 3rd time that morning. It's about understanding that this rifle might be the only thing standing between you and someone who wants to kill you. When you're careless with your weapon, you're not just risking your own life, you're risking the lives of everyone who depends on you. Private Foster, who'd become one of her most dedicated students, raised his hand. "Ma'am, what if we're in a situation where we don't have time for proper maintenance?" "What if there's always time?" Jessica interrupted, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd been tested in ways most people couldn't imagine. "In the desert, with my team bleeding out around me, I still took 30 seconds to clean my rifle's action before engaging targets. You know why?" The recruits waited, hanging on her every word. Because a jammed weapon is worse than no weapon at all. It gives you false confidence, makes you think you're protected when you're actually helpless. I've seen soldiers die because they trusted equipment they hadn't maintained properly. She moved among them, checking their work with the precise eye of someone who'd learned that perfection was the only acceptable standard. Every time you clean your weapon, you're honoring the people who died because their equipment failed them. Every time you calibrate your scope, you're preventing the kind of mistakes that turn friendly fire into tragedy. The recruits worked in focused silence, understanding that they weren't just learning technical skills. They were learning the mindset that separated survivors from casualties. Later that afternoon, Jessica was approached by Captain David Chun, the base's training coordinator. He'd been watching her work with the recruits and had been impressed by the transformation in their attitudes and skills. "Jessica," he said, using the informal address she preferred, "I've been thinking about expanding your role. The improvements you've made to the firing range are remarkable, but there are other areas where your expertise could—" "No," Jessica said firmly. "I'm not here to revolutionize the entire base. I'm here to make sure soldiers understand their equipment and respect the people who died to give them the freedom to make mistakes." Chun nodded, understanding her reluctance to take on additional responsibilities. "I respect that. But I have to ask, don't you want more? Don't you want recognition for what you've accomplished?" Jessica looked out over the firing range, where soldiers were practicing with the kind of focused intensity she'd never seen before her arrival. "I want them to go home alive," she said simply. "I want them to understand that every training exercise, every equipment check, every moment of preparation matters. That's all I've ever wanted. And if we offer you a commission, if we wanted to make you an officer—" "Officers give orders," Jessica replied. "I teach lessons. There's a difference." That evening, Jessica received an unexpected visitor. Colonel Ross knocked on the door of her small apartment off base, holding a bottle of whiskey and wearing the expression of a man who'd been carrying guilt for too long. "I know you don't want apologies," he said when she opened the door. "But I need to say something, and I need you to listen." Jessica stepped aside, allowing him to enter. Her apartment was sparse, functional, with few personal belongings except for a small memorial shrine on the mantelpiece, photos of two young soldiers, medals that had never been presented, and a folded flag that had never been given to family members. "Those are them," Ross said, recognizing the faces from 8-year-old intelligence photos, Jenkins and Martinez. "They were good soldiers," Jessica said, pouring 2 glasses of whiskey. "They trusted me to bring them home. I failed them." "You didn't fail them," Ross said firmly. "I failed them. I failed you. I made the decision that led to their deaths, and I've been living with that guilt for 8 years. He took a sip of whiskey, then continued. "When I saw you at the firing range, when I realized you were alive, it was like seeing a ghost. But not just any ghost. A ghost I'd created through my own incompetence." Jessica was quiet for a long moment, studying the photos on her mantelpiece. "You know what the worst part was? Not the airstrike, not being left for dead, not even losing my team. It was the silence afterward. The complete absence of any acknowledgment that we'd ever existed." "I know," Ross said. "I know, and I'm sorry. I'm sorry for the coordinate error, sorry for the cover-up, sorry for the 8 years you spent living like a ghost because I was too much of a coward to admit my mistakes." "The cover-up wasn't your idea," Jessica said. "I chose to stay dead. I chose to protect the families of the soldiers who died in that operation rather than expose the mistakes that led to their deaths." "Why?" Ross asked. "Why would you sacrifice your own life for people you'd never met?" Jessica touched the tattoo on her arm, the hawk with spread wings that had become her only connection to the woman she'd been before. "Because that's what soldiers do. We sacrifice ourselves for others. The only difference is that most soldiers die when they make that sacrifice. I gotta keep living, keep serving, keep making a difference." She turned to face him, her eyes holding depths of pain and strength that Ross couldn't fully comprehend. "I don't need your apologies, Colonel. I need your promise that the mistakes that killed my team won't be repeated. I need your word that every soldier on this base will be trained properly, equipped properly, and led properly." "You have it," Ross said without hesitation. "You have my word, and you have the resources to make it happen. Whatever you need, whatever changes you want to implement, you'll have my full support." Jessica nodded, satisfied. "Then we understand each other. I don't need recognition or rank or official status. I just need to know that when these kids go into combat, they'll be ready. They'll understand their equipment, respect their teammates, and remember that carelessness costs lives." As Ross prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "For what it's worth, I think you're the finest soldier I've ever known. Not because of your combat record or your decorations, but because you chose to serve even when the army failed you." After he left, Jessica stood alone in her apartment, looking at the photos of her fallen teammates. For 8 years, she'd carried their memory in silence, honoring their sacrifice through her own self-imposed exile. Now, finally, she had the chance to ensure their deaths hadn't been meaningless. Tomorrow, she would return to the firing range and continue the work she'd started. She would teach soldiers to respect their equipment, honor their training, and remember that every mistake in combat was paid for in blood. She was no longer a ghost haunting the margins of military life. She was a guardian, ensuring that the lessons learned from tragedy would protect the next generation of soldiers. And for the first time in 8 years, that felt like enough. 2 months after Jessica's return to the living, Redstone Army Base had undergone a quiet revolution. The changes weren't visible in official reports or training statistics, but they were evident in the way soldiers moved, worked, and thought about their responsibilities. Equipment failures had dropped to zero. Training accidents had become non-existent. More importantly, the soldiers themselves had developed a mindset that prioritized precision, preparation, and respect for the tools of their trade. They'd learned that their weapons, their equipment, and their training were all paid for with blood, sometimes their own, sometimes that of the soldiers who'd come before them. Jessica had become something more than an instructor. She'd become a legend, a living reminder that service meant sacrifice, and that the greatest honor wasn't in recognition, but in ensuring others could go home safely. "Tell me about the targeting system," she said to a group of advanced trainees as they worked with the range's most sophisticated equipment. "Not the technical specifications, tell me why it matters." Private Williams, the young soldier whose brother had died in special operations, spoke up. "Because if we get the coordinates wrong, we might hit our own people. We might create another Operation Kilo Dust." Jessica nodded approvingly. "And why do we check our equipment 3 times before every exercise?" "Because failure in training means death in combat," the group replied in unison. It had become their motto, their reminder that preparation was the difference between coming home and being carried home. "That's right," Jessica said. "Every time you touch your weapon, every time you calibrate your scope, every time you double-check your coordinates, you're honoring the people who died because their equipment failed them. You're preventing the kind of mistakes that turn soldiers into casualties." She moved among them, checking their work with the same precise attention she'd shown for months. Under her guidance, these soldiers had developed skills that surpassed anything seen at the base in years. More importantly, they developed a mindset that would keep them alive when training became reality. Later that afternoon, Jessica was surprised to find a delegation waiting for her in the equipment shed. General Hayes stood alongside several officers she didn't recognize, all wearing the kind of serious expressions that usually meant either very good news or very bad news. "Jessica," Hayes said, "I'd like you to meet Colonel Sandra Martinez from the Pentagon's Training and Doctrine Command, and Lieutenant Colonel Robert Jenkins from the Special Operations Training Division." The names hit Jessica like physical blows. Martinez and Jenkins, the same surnames as her fallen teammates. She studied their faces, looking for any resemblance to the soldiers who died in her arms 8 years ago. "Ma'am," Colonel Martinez said, stepping forward, "my younger brother was Corporal Diego Martinez. He died during Operation Kilo Dust." Jessica's expression didn't change, but her hand unconsciously moved to touch the tattoo on her arm. "He was a good soldier," she said quietly. "He held his position even after he was wounded. He saved my life 3 times in 2 days." Martinez's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. "For 8 years, our family believed he died in a classified operation that went wrong. We were told he was a hero, but we never knew the details. We never knew there was a survivor." Lieutenant Colonel Jenkins stepped forward next. "Staff Sergeant Michael Jenkins was my cousin. Our family has a long tradition of military service, but Mike was special. He was supposed to make it home, supposed to get married, supposed to have kids." "He did make it home," Jessica said, her voice carrying the weight of 8 years of grief. "He's buried in a classified cemetery under a headstone that bears his real name. I made sure of that. I made sure his sacrifice was recorded, even if it couldn't be acknowledged." The 2 officers exchanged glances, and Jessica realized this wasn't a coincidence. They hadn't just happened to visit Redstone base. They'd come specifically to meet her. "Ma'am," Jenkins said, "we're here to offer you a position. The Pentagon wants to implement your training methods across all special operations units. They want to make your protocols the standard for every soldier who carries a weapon. Jessica shook her head before he'd finished speaking. I'm not interested in Pentagon positions or official recognition. I'm interested in making sure soldiers understand their equipment and respect their training. That's exactly why we need you, Martinez said. What you've accomplished here in 2 months would normally take years to implement. Equipment failures are down 90%. Training accidents have been eliminated, and soldier confidence has increased dramatically. More importantly, Hayes added, you've changed the culture. These soldiers don't just follow procedures. They understand why the procedures exist. They don't just maintain their equipment. They honor the people who died because of equipment failures. Jessica looked around the equipment shed at the rifles and scopes and targeting systems she'd spent months perfecting. Every piece of equipment was calibrated to military precision, maintained with the kind of care that came from understanding its true cost. If I agreed to this, she said slowly, what would it involve? Travel to other bases, Jenkins replied. Training instructors. Implementing protocols, sharing the lessons you've learned. You'd have the authority to make changes, the resources to implement improvements, and the backing of the Pentagon to ensure compliance. And I'd still be a civilian contractor? If that's what you prefer, Martinez said. We're not interested in forcing you back into uniform. We're interested in your expertise, your experience, and your understanding of what it takes to keep soldiers alive. Jessica was quiet for a long moment, considering the offer. For 8 years, she'd lived in obscurity, working alone, making small differences in individual lives. This would be different a chance to prevent the kinds of mistakes that had killed her team on a much larger scale. I have conditions, she said finally. Name them, Hayes said immediately. First, I work alone. No assistants, no staff, no official recognition. I show up, I teach what needs to be taught, and I leave. Agreed. Second, I don't wear a uniform. I don't take a rank. I don't participate in ceremonies or official functions. I'm a civilian contractor, nothing more. Understood. Third, every soldier I train gets a copy of this. She pulled out a small card with the number 032K printed on it. It's not a memorial or a decoration. It's a reminder that someone died to teach them what they're learning. The officers exchanged glances, understanding the significance of what she was asking. She wanted every soldier to carry a piece of her team's memory, a constant reminder of the cost of carelessness. We can make that happen, Martinez said. Jessica nodded slowly. Then I'll do it. Not for the Pentagon, not for recognition, not for any official purpose. I'll do it to honor the memory of Corporal Diego Martinez and Staff Sergeant Michael Jenkins, and to make sure their sacrifice teaches lessons that keep other soldiers alive. She looked directly at Martinez and Jenkins, seeing something in their eyes that she hadn't expected, not just grief for their lost family members, but gratitude for the woman who'd carried their memory for 8 years. Your brother and your cousin died as heroes, she told them. They held their positions, protected their teammate, and followed their orders even when everything went wrong. The world may never know their names, but every soldier I train will carry their memory. As the delegation prepared to leave, Private Foster approached with several other soldiers from Jessica's training group. They'd sewn small patches onto their uniforms, a simple design featuring the numbers 032K beneath a hawk with spread wings. Ma'am, Foster said, we wanted you to know that we'll keep carrying this with us, wherever we go. We'll remember what it means, and we'll make sure other soldiers understand it too. Jessica studied the patches, recognizing the crude but heartfelt craftsmanship. These soldiers had chosen to mark themselves with their team's memory to carry the weight of that sacrifice into their own service. Good, she said simply. Remember that those numbers represent real people who died doing their jobs. Remember that your equipment, your training, and your preparation are all paid for with blood. Remember that carelessness costs lives. As the soldiers dispersed, Jessica remained in the equipment shed, surrounded by the tools she'd spent months perfecting. Tomorrow, she would begin a new mission, not as a ghost haunting the margins of military life, but as a guardian ensuring that the lessons learned from tragedy would protect soldiers across the entire army. She was no longer just honoring the memory of her fallen teammates. She was ensuring that their sacrifice would save lives for generations to come. The teaching would continue, but now it would reach far beyond the boundaries of Redstone Army Base. Every soldier who learned from her would carry a piece of that memory forward, spreading the lessons that had been paid for with blood 8 years ago in a desert far from home. 6 months into her new role, Jessica had visited 14 military installations across the country. At each base, she'd encountered the same pattern: overconfident soldiers, poorly maintained equipment, and training protocols that prioritize speed over precision. And at each base, she'd left behind a transformed understanding of what it meant to be a soldier. Her reputation had grown beyond anything she'd intended. Stories spread through military networks about the civilian contractor who could fix any weapon system, who demanded perfection from every soldier, and who carried the memory of fallen teammates in a tattoo that had become legend. But it was at Fort Carson, Colorado, that Jessica encountered something she hadn't expected: resistance. "I don't care what she accomplished at other bases," Major Richard Blackwood told his assembled staff. "This is my training facility, and we run things according to my standards. I'm not going to have some civilian contractor with a sob story come in here and tell us how to do our jobs." Blackwood was a career officer who'd spent 15 years climbing the military hierarchy through politics rather than competence. He'd never seen combat, never lost soldiers under his command, and never faced the kind of life-or-death decisions that forged real leaders. To him, Jessica represented a threat to his authority, a party, a civilian who'd somehow gained influence over military training without going through proper channels. "Sir," Captain Lisa Wong said carefully, "the reports from other installations are remarkable. Equipment failures down 90%, training accidents eliminated entirely, soldier confidence dramatically improved. Reports can be manipulated." Blackwood interrupted. "I want to see what this woman can actually do before I hand over my training protocols to someone who's been officially dead for 8 years. When Jessica arrived at Fort Carson, she immediately sensed the hostility. Unlike other bases where she'd been welcomed with respect born of reputation, here she was met with skepticism and barely concealed resentment. "Ms. Reynolds," Blackwood said, emphasizing the civilian title, "I understand you've been making quite an impression at other facilities. I'm curious to see if your methods will work with real soldiers rather than the trainees you've been working with elsewhere." Jessica recognized the challenge in his tone, the attempt to diminish her authority before she'd even begun. She'd encountered similar attitudes before, though usually from soldiers who changed their minds once they saw her work. "Major," she replied calmly, "I'm here to teach equipment maintenance and respect for training protocols. If your soldiers already understand those concepts, then my work here will be brief." "Oh, I'm sure it will be," Blackwood said with a smirk. "Let's start with the targeting systems. I'm told you're something of an expert." He led her to the firing range, where a complex targeting computer had been deliberately miscalibrated. It was a test, not of her technical skills, but of her ability to work under pressure and skepticism. Jessica approached the system, immediately recognizing the deliberate sabotage. Someone had introduced multiple errors into the calibration, creating a puzzle that would take most technicians hours to solve. But as she began working, she realized this wasn't just a test of her abilities. It was an attempt to humiliate her in front of Blackwood's soldiers. "This system has been deliberately miscalibrated," she said, not looking up from the control panel. multiple errors introduced in sequence to create maximum confusion. Someone spent considerable time making this as difficult as possible to fix. "Are you saying you can't handle it?" Blackwood asked, his voice carrying across the range where soldiers had gathered to watch. "I'm saying that whoever did this doesn't understand the difference between a test and sabotage," Jessica replied, her hands moving with practiced efficiency across the controls. In combat, equipment fails because of wear, damage, or poor maintenance. It doesn't fail because someone deliberately broke it to prove a point. Within 10 minutes, she'd identified and corrected all the calibration errors. The targeting system came online with perfect precision, its displays showing the kind of accuracy that Blackwood's technicians had never achieved. "Impressive," Blackwood said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But fixing equipment is different from teaching soldiers. Let's see how you handle a real training exercise." He called over a squad of soldiers, all handpicked for their skeptical attitudes and resistance to outside authority. "This is Alpha Squad. They're scheduled for advanced marksmanship training this afternoon. Why don't you show us these revolutionary methods we've heard so much about?" Jessica studied the soldiers, recognizing the setup immediately. These weren't typical trainees. They were Blackwood's chosen representatives, prepared to resist any instruction that came from a civilian contractor. Their weapons were clean but not pristine, their attitudes confident but not respectful. "Before we begin," Jessica said, addressing the squad directly, "I want you to understand something. I'm not here to teach you how to shoot. You already know that. I'm here to teach you how to survive when everything goes wrong." She picked up one of their rifles, examining it with the kind of attention that made several soldiers shift uncomfortably. "This weapon is clean, but not maintained. The action has been lubricated, but not properly. The scope has been zeroed, but not calibrated for environmental conditions." "Hey," one of the soldiers protested, "that rifle passed inspection this morning." "Inspection standards and survival standards are different things," Jessica interrupted. "In combat, good enough gets people killed. When your life depends on your weapon, good enough isn't good enough." She began disassembling the rifle with movements so fluid they seemed choreographed. 8 years ago, I had a teammate who thought his weapon was properly maintained. It jammed during a firefight, and he died trying to clear it. He passed inspection, too. The soldiers watched in silence as she identified and corrected maintenance issues they hadn't even known existed. Her hands moved with the kind of precision that came from years of experience. But more importantly, her voice carried the weight of someone who'd paid for her knowledge with blood. "Ma'am," one of the soldiers asked quietly, "how do we know when our equipment is really ready?" "When you would bet your life on it," Jessica replied. "Because someday you will." Major Blackwood had been watching the demonstration with growing unease. His carefully selected soldiers were responding to Jessica's instruction with the kind of attention they'd never shown him. They were asking questions, taking notes, treating her words with the respect reserved for someone who'd earned the right to teach through experience. "That's enough," he said abruptly. "I think we've seen all we need to see." But the soldiers didn't move. They continued working on their weapons, applying the lessons Jessica had taught them, absorbed in learning. That might save their lives someday. "I said that's enough," Blackwood repeated, his voice sharp with authority. This time, the soldiers reluctantly stepped back, but their expressions showed a hunger for knowledge that Blackwood had never inspired. They wanted to learn more, to understand the lessons that had been paid for with the lives of soldiers they'd never met. "Thank you, ma'am," the squad leader said quietly. "We'd like to continue this training if possible." Before Jessica could respond, Blackwood stepped between them. "This training session is over. Alpha Squad, you're dismissed." As the soldiers reluctantly dispersed, Jessica found herself alone with Blackwood on the firing range. The Major's expression had hardened, his earlier skepticism replaced by something closer to hostility. "I don't know what game you're playing," he said, "but it's not going to work here. These soldiers follow my orders, train according to my protocols, and answer to my authority. I'm not going to have some civilian contractor undermine everything I've built." Jessica studied his face, recognizing the fear beneath the anger. This wasn't about training protocols or military authority. This was about a man who'd built his career on mediocrity being confronted by someone who represented excellence. "Major," she said calmly, "I'm not here to undermine your authority. I'm here to make sure your soldiers go home alive." "My soldiers are perfectly capable of staying alive without your help," Blackwood replied. "We've been training soldiers for years without needing some ghost story to motivate them." "Ghost story?" Jessica's voice remained calm, but something shifted in her expression. "Is that what you think this is?" She rolled up her sleeve, exposing the tattoo that had become legend throughout the military. "This isn't a ghost story, Major. This is a memorial. Those numbers represent 2 soldiers who died because their equipment failed them. They died because their training wasn't good enough, because their leaders weren't prepared for reality." Blackwood looked at the tattoo with undisguised contempt. "A lot of soldiers have died, Ms. Reynolds. That doesn't make you special." "You're right," Jessica said. "It doesn't make me special, but it makes me responsible. Responsible for making sure other soldiers don't die the same way. Responsible for teaching lessons that were paid for with blood." She stepped closer, her voice never rising but carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "Those soldiers who just asked to continue training, they understand something you don't. They understand that their weapons, their equipment, and their training might be the only thing standing between them and death. They want to learn because they want to live. They want to live. They'll follow orders and trust their training," Blackwood shot back. "They don't need some civilian contractor filling their heads with war stories and paranoia." "War stories?" Jessica repeated, her voice still calm, but her eyes holding depths that made Blackwood step back involuntarily. "Is that what you think I'm telling them?" She touched the tattoo on her arm, the hawk with spread wings that represented everything she'd lost and everything she'd learned. "I'm not telling them war stories, Major. I'm telling them survival stories. I'm teaching them the lessons that keep soldiers alive when everything goes wrong." The confrontation was interrupted by the arrival of Colonel Martinez and Lieutenant Colonel Jenkins, who'd driven down from the Pentagon to observe Jessica's work at Fort Carson. They'd heard about the resistance she was encountering and had come to assess the situation personally. "Major Blackwood," Martinez said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who outranked him significantly, "we need to talk." As the 3 officers walked away, Jessica remained on the firing range, surrounded by the weapons and equipment she'd been brought to improve. Tomorrow, she would continue her work, whether Blackwood approved or not. She would teach the soldiers who wanted to learn, and she would honor the memory of the teammates who died to give her these lessons. The resistance was expected. The hostility was familiar. But the hunger for knowledge she'd seen in those soldiers' eyes reminded her why she'd taken this mission in the first place. The teaching would continue, one soldier at a time, one lesson at a time, one life saved at a time. The next morning brought changes that rippled through Fort Carson like an earthquake. Major Blackwood had been reassigned to a desk job at the Pentagon, a lateral move that everyone understood was actually a demotion. In his place, Colonel Martinez had temporarily assumed command of the training facility, effective immediately. Martinez announced to the assembled training staff, "All equipment maintenance and training protocols will be conducted under the supervision of Jessica Reynolds. Any interference with her methods or instructions will be considered insubordination." The transformation was immediate and dramatic. Soldiers who'd been restricted from additional training the day before now lined up for equipment maintenance. Instruction. The same troops who'd been dismissed from Jessica's demonstration were back, eager to learn the lessons that might save their lives. Today we're going to talk about equipment failure under stress. Jessica told a group of 50 soldiers gathered on the firing range. Not the kind of stress you experience during training, but the kind of stress you experience when people are trying to kill you. She held up a rifle that appeared to be in perfect condition. This weapon has passed every inspection, met every standard, and satisfied every requirement in the Army manual. But it will fail in combat. Can anyone tell me why? A young sergeant raised her hand. Because it hasn't been prepared for real conditions? Exactly, Jessica said. Military specifications are written for controlled environments. Combat isn't controlled. Combat is chaos, confusion, and equipment pushed beyond its design limits. She began disassembling the rifle, her movements precise and economical. In the desert 8 years ago, my teammate's weapon looked exactly like this. Clean, functional, ready for inspection. But the sand got into the action. The heat expanded the metal components, and when he needed it most, it jammed. The soldiers watched in complete silence as she revealed maintenance issues that had been invisible during inspection. He died trying to clear that jam. Died because he trusted equipment that had passed inspection, but hadn't been prepared for reality. "Ma'am," one of the soldiers asked, "how do we prepare our equipment for conditions we haven't experienced yet?" "By understanding that your weapon isn't just a tool, it's your lifeline," Jessica replied. "You maintain it not to pass inspection, but to save your life. You prepare it not for the conditions you expect, but for the conditions you can't imagine." She spent the next 4 hours teaching maintenance techniques that went far beyond military standards. She showed them how to modify equipment for extreme environments, how to identify potential failure points before they became critical, and how to maintain functionality under conditions that would destroy poorly prepared equipment. More importantly, she taught them the mindset that separated survivors from casualties. Every time you touch your weapon, remember that someone died to teach you what you're learning. Every time you check your equipment, honor the people who didn't come home, because their preparation wasn't good enough. By the end of the day, the soldiers weren't just better trained, they were transformed. They understood that their equipment, their training, and their preparation were all paid for with blood. They'd learned that carelessness cost lives, and that the greatest honor they could show their predecessors was to survive and come home safely. 3 weeks later, Jessica received news that validated everything she'd been working toward. A special operations team deployed to Afghanistan had encountered equipment failures that should have been catastrophic. Instead of becoming casualties, they'd used maintenance techniques Jessica had taught them to keep their weapons functional under extreme conditions. 2 soldiers came home alive because of what you taught them, Colonel Martinez told her during a private meeting. They faced the same kind of equipment failures that killed your teammates 8 years ago, but they were prepared. They survived. Jessica nodded, feeling something she hadn't experienced since her teammates' deaths, a sense that their sacrifice had finally accomplished something meaningful. "Good," she said simply. "That's what we wanted. The Pentagon wants to expand the program," Martinez continued. "They want to make your training protocols mandatory for all combat units. They want to institutionalize everything you've taught." "No," Jessica said immediately. "Institutions kill innovation. Bureaucracy destroys urgency. The moment this becomes a mandatory program, it becomes another checkbox on a training schedule." "Then what do you suggest?" Jessica was quiet for a moment, considering the question. Let it spread naturally. Soldier to soldier, unit to unit, base to base. Let the soldiers who've learned these lessons teach them to others. Let the people who understand the cost pass that understanding along. She pulled out one of the small cards bearing the numbers 032K that had become ubiquitous throughout the military. This isn't a training program or an official protocol. It's a memorial that teaches lessons. It works because it's personal, because every soldier who carries it understands that real people died to give them this knowledge. And you? Martinez asked. What's next for you? Jessica looked out the window at the firing range where soldiers were practicing with equipment maintained to standards that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. I keep teaching, she said. One soldier at a time, one lesson at a time, one life saved at a time. You know, you're a legend now, Martinez said with a slight smile. The ghost who came back to life, the woman who turned a tattoo into a movement. Legends are for people who want to be remembered, Jessica replied. I just want soldiers to go home alive. 6 months later, Jessica stood in a military cemetery outside Arlington, Virginia. She'd driven there alone, without announcement or ceremony, to visit the graves of soldiers whose names would never appear on public monuments, but whose service had earned them a place among heroes. The headstones were simple, bearing only names, ranks, and dates. No mention of classified operations or heroic sacrifices. No acknowledgment of the price they'd paid for missions that officially never happened. She found the graves she was looking for Corporal Diego Martinez and Staff Sergeant Michael Jenkins, buried side by side in the section reserved for soldiers who died in classified operations. For 8 years, she'd been the only person alive who could visit these graves and truly understand what they represented. But she wasn't alone anymore. Standing beside the headstones were 2 figures she recognized, Colonel Sandra Martinez and Lieutenant Colonel Robert Jenkins, the family members who'd found her at Redstone Base months earlier. We come here a month, Sandra Martinez said, quietly, ever since we learned the truth about what happened. Ever since we understood that our family members died as heroes. They were heroes before they died, Jessica replied. They became heroes the day they chose to serve. Death didn't make them heroic, it just made them gone. She knelt beside the headstones, placing small American flags at the base of each one. But their sacrifice teaches lessons now. Every soldier who learns proper equipment maintenance, every soldier who takes their training seriously, every soldier who comes home alive, they're all honoring the memory of these men. Robert Jenkins wiped tears from his eyes. My cousin would have been proud to know that his death prevented other deaths. He always said the worst part of military service wasn't the danger. It was the thought that your sacrifice might be meaningless. No sacrifice is meaningless if it teaches lessons that save lives, Jessica said. Their deaths weren't the end of their service. They were the beginning of a different kind of service. Every soldier who carries that card with their unit number is carrying their memory into combat. As the 3 of them stood in silence beside the graves, Jessica felt something she hadn't experienced in 8 years' peace. Not the peace of closure, but the peace of purpose fulfilled. Her teammates' deaths had finally accomplished what they'd intended. They'd made other soldiers safer, better prepared, more likely to come home alive. The tattoo on her arm would always be a memorial, but it was no longer a burden. It had become what it was always meant to be, a reminder that some battles are fought so others can sleep safely at night, and that the greatest honor anyone can show fallen soldiers is to learn from their sacrifice. Thank you, Sandra Martinez said as they prepared to leave. Thank you for carrying their memory, for honoring their sacrifice, for making sure their death saved other lives. Thank you for letting me, Jessica replied. For 8 years, I was the only person who remembered them. Now their memory lives in hundreds of soldiers who carry their lesson into combat. They're not forgotten anymore, they're teachers. As she drove away from the cemetery, Jessica thought about the soldiers she'd trained, the lives she'd probably saved, the lessons that would continue spreading long after she was gone. She was no longer a ghost haunting the margins of military life. No longer a woman living in the shadow of her own official death. She was exactly what she'd always been, a soldier serving her country, honoring her fallen teammates, and making sure that the people who came after her were better prepared than she had been. The mission continued, one lesson at a time, one life saved at a time, one soldier at a time. In the end, that was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Remember, everyone you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. Some of those battles were fought so you could sleep safely at night. The next time you see someone carrying invisible weight, don't laugh, say thank you. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.